Hello and welcome to Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a low carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we're your hosts for Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we tell a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities.
Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., and it makes up about a quarter of all the energy-related greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And despite very real progress in EV sales in many countries and in several states in the U.S., including California, and the inevitable hype around electric vehicles, the news lately seems to be filled with production delays, factories being postponed, models being canceled, and the ever-present concern about a charging network that can often seem unstable or inefficient for the growing market.
We still have a long way to go to reach our climate goals, including California's commitment to transition fully to electric vehicle sales by 2035. But we're making progress. The US bought over 1 million EVs through the end of 2023, which made over 7% of all vehicles sold in the US and 20% of auto sales in California. Globally, 9.5 million EVs were sold in 2023, and a 31% increase from the prior year. This increase was driven by China, where battery-powered vehicles made up around a third of the passenger car market late last year. Europe is chugging along nicely as well.
In today's episode, we talk about the future of electric vehicles with Dr. Beth Spiller, Transportation Program Director at Resources for the Future, a nonprofit that conducts economic research and policy engagement on topics including energy and transportation. We then chat with Chris Merola, a film student at USC, and Beth Prakash, a new EV owner in the Bay Area, to hear about their experiences and thoughts on driving an EV.
Here is our conversation with Dr. Spiller.
We're delighted to have Dr. Beth Spiller as our guest today. Dr. Spiller is an energy economist and the Transportation Program Director and Fellow at Resources for the Future, a nonprofit research institution in DC. Prior to her current role, she was the lead senior economist at global nonprofit Environmental Defense Fund for almost a decade. Her recent efforts have focused around electric vehicles and environmental justice. She holds a PhD in economics from Duke University. Dr. Spiller, thank you so much for joining us on Energy Transition Talk.
Thank you for having me.
So we'd love to start off by hearing a little bit about your background and what inspired you to focus your career on transportation and electrification of transportation.
So I got started in environmental policy. That's what I studied in undergrad at UC San Diego. And then I went on to get a master's in public policy in Argentina. And that really showed me how important policymaking really is, to be able to improve our livelihoods. During my PhD at Duke, I was in the econ department, but my advisor was an environmental focused professor. And so all my work was around environmental economics, and I was doing work in the transportation space. So when I got out of grad school, I went directly into the NGO space. As you mentioned, I was at EDF, but I also did a postdoc at RFF, and now for the past year and a half, I've been back at RFF. And here I was really working on transportation, electrification, and the electric grid. So it was a little bit of both. I got really excited about transportation electrification, mainly because of, how beneficial it could be if we're actually able to decarbonize the transportation space. And, I think it's really exciting just to be part of this transition, right? We're in the middle of this revolution, really, when we think about transportation. And so being able to be part of that, part of those conversations and part of the policymaking process is really exciting for me.
Thank you. That is wonderful to hear kind of your own process. And maybe could we go back to basics and start with an overview of the topic? So what do we mean when we talk about electrifying transportation, and why is it so important for the energy transition?
Electrifying transportation is a really promising solution for decarbonizing the transport sector. And it's really important that we decarbonize it because it contributes to about 28% of US greenhouse gas emissions. And that percentage is only expected to grow. So if we really want to get to a net zero future, a clean economy, we need to focus on decarbonizing vehicles. And it's not just important from a global warming perspective. It's also really important for equity because a lot of this transportation pollution disproportionately affects low income and Black and brown communities, mainly due to really racist transportation and housing policies that have caused these households to have to live closer to major roadways, highways, and depots. And so they're more exposed to the pollution. So if we can electrify transport, you're not just going to achieve these great global warming impacts, you also have the opportunity to improve the well-being and the health of communities who have been so affected by transportation pollution.
And maybe painting a picture for our audience, do we have a sense of the percent of vehicles that are EVs today, or maybe what the projected is in the automotive market in the US and globally, and maybe how much that needs to still increase to reach those energy and climate goals?
Well, what we're seeing, at least in the United States, is sort of big headway in light duty vehicle markets. So in passenger cars and trucks. Last year, for example, the sales of hybrids, plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles accounted for about 16% of new vehicle sales in the US, and half of that, it's about 8%, was purely electric vehicles. There's other parts of the world that are doing a lot better in terms of adoption. So China and Norway are really great examples that have really pushed to have a lot more electric vehicles, but the US is sort of lagging behind. Now we are at 8%. Usually when we think about transitions in the market, once you hit that 5% of new sales being the new technology, it's sort of understood to be a tipping point, right? Past that 5%, you start getting economies of scale, and you're able to ramp up production a lot faster. So we would expect this to grow a lot more in the United States, and there's a lot of policies that are pushing for it. Right now, the federal government has investments through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill that are targeted towards electric vehicle manufacturing, charging station investments, as well as incentives for purchasing these vehicles. So there's a lot of push by the federal government, and there's also at the state level, several states across the country, including California and a number of northeastern states, have adopted mandates that say that manufacturers need to sell all electric vehicles, within the next 10 years or so. And so between the federal government and the state, pushing this forward, we do expect to see growth. That's in the light duty vehicle space. The medium heavy duty vehicle space, that's a lot slower. Yes, we do have incentives and we have new efficiency standards. We also have some state mandates, but it's been really, really slow, mainly due to how challenging it is to electrify these vehicles. And we can get into that a little bit later. But there's a couple areas that, are seeing a little bit more growth. And that is, for example, electric school buses. There's this really big federal incentives that cover that incremental cost between diesel and electric. So there's been a lot more pickup in terms of school bus electrification. Another exciting growth area is delivery vehicles, particularly local regional delivery. So what we're seeing is large companies like Amazon, UPS are making big orders of electric vehicles and are sort of making promises to electrify their fleet. But it's still less than about 0.5% of new truck sales are electric. So we have a long way to go. Now, I do want to point out one thing, which is really exciting, is the role for technological innovation to actually increase the adoption. And one really great example is the Tesla semi-truck. This Tesla semi-truck gets 500 miles, and that 500-mile range, that's huge. That's a massive increase from what it was before. So before the Tesla Semi came out, you had the longest range was like 350 miles. It's a game changer. And with these new really big fast chargers, the megawatt chargers, you can recharge the Tesla Semi in half an hour, almost to 80%. And so that is just a game changer. And so we might expect to see more adoption, as the megawatt chargers are starting to be deployed and as people have access to these longer range vehicles.
Speaking of Tesla and Elon Musk, We can't talk about EVs without bringing that into the conversation. Can you talk a little bit more about how Tesla has revolutionized the automotive industry and changed the conversation around the future of transportation?
So I think the biggest thing that Tesla did was make electric vehicles cool. Right before Tesla came about, electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles were sort of I like to call it the Birkenstock of the car market, right? It was something that was for hippies and and for people who just cared about the environment. It wasn't something that was like, look at this cool piece of technology that I have. So Tesla really flipped that on its head and made it really attractive to people who otherwise, don't care that much about the environment, but really want a cool toy. And so it really spoke to the luxury market. So people who were, able to pay for it, now shifting away from BMWs and purchasing Teslas, right? Instead of purchasing a Mercedes, they get a Tesla. So you have this big growth because now with Tesla being cool and showing how powerful it is, right? Before Tesla came out, everybody, like, for popular conception was EVs are slow, they don't have any torque, they don't have the power. Right now they're being used in these Formula One races and they're winning, right? So it was a public perception shift that I think cannot be overstated. So that's one way that Tesla sort of changed the way we think about electric vehicles. I also think Tesla is a really interesting model because they do a lot through vertical integration. So what do? Like, starting with the batteries, they source their own critical minerals for the batteries. They make their own batteries. Obviously, they make the vehicle, and they have their own charging stations. So it's vertically integrated from every single bit of the vehicle to the powering of the vehicle. And that's really important because they wanted to make sure that the people who are purchasing their vehicles have all different parts of this ownership thing covered. Anywhere from maintenance issues, you're concerned about the battery. Hey, Tesla's making the battery, we can take care of this, right? To fueling, they give individuals free charging for the first 3 years of purchasing the vehicle. So they're able, and they have this huge incentive to make sure that their charging stations work. So Tesla has the biggest charging station network in the country and the most reliable one. You know that it's really going to work when you show up to a charging station, and that's really, really important. And another way in which they've sort of revolutionized things is through the plug itself. So because Tesla's charging station network was so reliable and so well spread, it really made other manufacturers think like, hey, could we join that network? And so last summer, spring, Ford and other manufacturers began to say, we're going to make our vehicles compatible with the Tesla charger. And so the organization that makes standards actually took the plug and created a standard. And so there's this issue with, how Tesla was able to transform this hodgepodge mishmash of different charging types to say, like, here's the clear winner. And the good thing about the NACS plug, the one that's with Tesla, it works with both level 2 and with fast charging. So it's a really beneficial thing that Tesla was able to do in terms of leading to greater compatibility in charging stations.
A bit ago, we started talking about environmental justice and kind of all the implications that came with electrification or the lack thereof. But maybe there's also the other side of the coin where we're talking about equity and concerns regarding electrification in transportation. So maybe there are maybe other issues in the cities that they might be facing regarding electric cars, trucks, and maybe the bus adoptions when we're talking about environmental justice.
Yeah, so I like to think about the fact that we're doing this massive transition to electric vehicles, and there's a really big opportunity here to leverage that transition to get more equitable outcomes. So the question is, who is really benefiting from adoption of EVs? Who can benefit financially, in terms of air quality, and so on? So What the challenge is, what we've seen so far is that because electric vehicles are more expensive than their gasoline alternative, and for a number of other reasons, we've really seen that those who are benefiting the most from EV adoption currently are white and wealthy households. Right, they're, from the ownership perspective, they're the ones who have been more able to afford these vehicles, right? And so, we think about lower income people maybe are not actually buying into the new vehicle market and are more dependent on a used vehicle market. The secondhand market in electric vehicles is not as robust and sort of low cost as the secondhand market for gasoline vehicles, right? It's be really hard for you to find a $5,000 electric vehicle, but you could totally find that with gasoline, right? And so even if there are some used vehicles, they're still not that cheap. So there is this wealth gap that makes it harder for low income individuals to actually own the vehicle and then benefit from the fact that they have lower cost of refueling. Another challenge is accessibility to private charging. When you have access to charging it in your own garage, you can really benefit because, one, you can charge it every single day. It's very easy. You have this sort of ease of use. It can help alleviate range anxiety. But also, if you have access to time of use pricing, so on your electric bill, sometimes electric utilities will charge you lower rates if you charge your vehicle overnight, significantly lower. Right? And so you can actually get really, really cheap charging by charging overnight in a place where in your garage, right, when you have time of use pricing. However, on the lower income individuals are more likely to live in multifamily homes where they don't have garages. They're more likely to rent homes, which means that they don't have ownership of the house and are less able to install a plug, right? That requires the homeowner to make structural changes to the home. And so if they're not the owner, they have less opportunity for home charging. And so they are going to be really reliant upon public charging stations. Well, what happens? Where are the public charging stations? They're in white and wealthy neighborhoods. They are not in underserved communities or communities that have really high populations of low income and Black and brown populations, mainly because that's not where the EVs are being owned. And so private companies are not going to invest in these locations. Sure, there's some, but if you actually look at the amount of charging stations in white and wealthy neighborhoods, it far surpasses the amount in underserved communities and low income communities. And so, if you are forced to rely on public charging stations, they're not in your community. But if they are, it's more expensive to charge. You're not benefiting as much from that transition. So this is one of the big challenges in terms of light duty vehicle electrification inequities.
Do you know if the Biden administration's recent initiatives to increase EV charging infrastructure throughout the nation are taking this into account in trying to put more infrastructure in those minority communities?
So there's two different policies right now, two different investment avenues. One of them is called the NEVI funds, which is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Fund. This has lots of money going to states for investment in fast charging on highway corridors. Okay, so states are receiving funds from the federal government and then have to figure out, where do we put these charging stations along major roadways, major corridors. So that's a really important funding opportunity that if the state understands the challenges that medium heavy duty vehicle operators face, they will ensure that some of those funds are going to invest in public charging stations for medium heavy duty vehicles. These are not the same. You don't just have the same charger for a light duty vehicle as a medium heavy duty vehicle, because you have to think about the space. You also have to think about the size. We're talking about megawatt chargers. We're talking about really level 2 or the smaller fast chargers. These big trucks are going to need the fastest chargers, which you wouldn't actually need for passenger cars. So there is an opportunity there. There's also the second funding stream, which is the CFI grant, which is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Grant Program. What this does is it actually provides funds to communities to cities and local agencies, so not the state level, to actually invest in charging stations, generally more around level 2 charging stations in cities, and with a particular focus on investing in low income and underrepresented communities. So between the CFI funds and the NEVI funds, we should see a lot more investments in charging stations that hopefully will be able to reduce these at least inequities in access, and make sure that there's more charging stations in proximity of low-income households and also along those major road corridors that can help fleets electrify.
You have the inequity problems. How do we rethink your point about rethinking our transportation system when we had this massive infrastructure build that largely said, I want to get through these neighborhoods as fast as I can, and I don't want to stop. And then it destroyed kind of local businesses and all the rest of this. And when you have that, how can we begin to think about that element? I mean, all those other things you said, I think, are very appropriate. But there's this basic element that in the 1960s we just destroyed those neighborhoods with our freeways.
I mean, you bring up really great points. Or one of the things that's really important when we think about equity in the transition to electric vehicles is procedural justice, right? What role do communities have in saying where these investments are going to take place? That's really important, because maybe they don't want the charging stations in their community, right? Maybe they don't want it because it takes away their parking spots. They're like, hey, we don't even have the EVs. Why do we have this here? It's leading to gentrification. All these issues that, or like where in the community would be best to have it? Do they actually want it in the Walmart, or do they want it on Main Street, right? There's questions that unless we involve the community in the decision-making process, it can be very likely that we will make decisions that will increase inequities. And so bringing the community into the decision-making process is one key aspect of how we can improve equity with our clean energy transition. A second point is that, when we think about equity and what do these communities need, one of the things that is really challenging in the United States is lack of mobility, especially in, underserved communities. Why? Because the transportation system has historically been built up to benefit wealthier and white neighborhoods. And I'll just got one very great example is in New York City. So back in the beginning of the 1900s, if you look at a map of what New York City used to look like, it was just so many above ground trams connecting all parts of the city with each other. So you didn't require a car, right? You could get around very easily, very quickly with these above ground trams. In the 1930s, the infamous urban planner Robert Moses, who's actually very known for his very racist policies, came in and decided to re-envision New York City. And so he got rid of all the trams, only left the subway system, and built highways. These highways cut through Black and brown communities and did nothing to help connect lower income and Black and brown households with other parts of the city. And in fact, if you look at the structure of the New York City subways, they all go into Manhattan. It's all about connecting everyone with Manhattan and not about connecting the outer boroughs together. So even I live in Brooklyn, to go to Queens, which is a 10-minute drive via subway, takes me an hour. I have to go all the way into the city and then come all the way back out. So there's a lack of mobility. And this lack of mobility is pervasive across the country. It's very similar in lots of different cities. These types of policies have been made. And so when we think about the energy transition, we think about the transportation, electrification, we have to start thinking a lot broader than just vehicle electrification, right? How do we connect communities? How do we improve mobility, right? What are the solutions? Can we think holistically about solutions? And this is going to include things like public transit, improving public transit options, right? Making sure that people can get around. Micromobility, right? How do we get more bike stations and, scooters, things that can help people get around without their vehicles? And electric vehicles don't solve any of those problems. All they do is change the fuel that's used to power the vehicle, right? It does not necessarily improve mobility. Now, that being said, you can think of ways to leverage those investments to actually improve mobility. For example, you could co-locate a bike charging station by an electric vehicle charging station. You're building up the infrastructure anyways to allow to have that capacity. You can put in bike charging stations there, right? Or you can think about if we upgrade the grid so that we can have these fast chargers, we're also improving electric grid reliability for neighboring households, right? And so they can have less blackouts or those types of benefits. There's also other solutions that have been explored. For example, one of my colleagues at RFF, Suzanne Rousseau, used to work at Pecan Street in Austin. And one of the things that they were actually trying to do was come up with electrification solutions that improve mobility. So they had this solution, which was a shuttle bus. It was an electric shuttle bus that was on demand. And so the shuttle bus would basically go to individuals' homes and pick them up and help them with mobility. And so here's one way you can say, let's electrify this specific type of vehicle and then use it to improve mobility, right, for those underserved neighborhoods. So I think we do need to think much more creatively about what the transition to electric vehicles can bring us in terms of equity, both improving mobility, but also to be able to give these communities a voice, as to how that transition looks like and how it's affecting them.
We're talking that EVs are mostly talked about for cars than for trucks. And I'm curious, could electrification also be a game changer for motorbikes and scooters, especially maybe across Asia and other countries in the developing world, where those two-wheel vehicles make up a huge chunk of mobility in many countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think India is a really interesting example. So electric two-wheelers, e-bikes, e-motorcycles have become really pervasive. Last year was about 6% of new vehicle sales, but it's projected to get up to 70%. So it's a really vibrant market. Part of this was brought about by this really favorable subsidy that the Indian government had that covered a lot of the upfront purchase of the vehicle. That was recently scaled down, and immediately after that subsidy dropped in magnitude, there was this slump in sales of electric motorbikes. So we'll see if they bring the subsidy back. But it's a really great opportunity, right? It gives you a lot of mobility. What's exciting, I think, about the motorcycles more broadly is that they have a lot smaller batteries. So you don't need as many critical minerals, but it doesn't have such a big impact on the grid. It's almost negligible, the power that it would take to charge it. So it allows you to electrify transport, provides a much cheaper option, right? I mean, an electric bike, you could spend maybe $1,000 on an e-bike, on a bicycle, right? An electric bicycle that goes 20 miles per hour versus $50,000 on a car. It's a big game changer for folks who don't have a ton of money. And so being able to have these electric bikes increase mobility while also allowing it to be electric, and that can really help mobility. And you're seeing, for example, these e-bikes bike share. So this is happening a lot in cities across the country, right? Where you have city bikes or like Lyft or Lime, right? They have these electric bicycles that provide significant mobility options. So it's a huge benefit. And I think that it will take off a lot. And we've been seeing a really big increase in e-bikes here in New York City and in DC. So hopefully that will be a solution that will be part of this transition.
Great. That's really interesting. So as we're nearing the end of our conversation, Dr. Spiller, we'd love to end kind of on an optimistic note, or just to hear a little bit about what inspires or motivates you about the future of energy and of transportation.
I think the thing that inspires me the most is to think about how we can leverage this energy transition to improve equity outcomes, right? Because a lot of the engineering and sort of technical issues have been worked out or on the cusp of it. But I don't think that we've done a really great job at thinking about, how can we get the most out of the energy transition in terms of increasing participation with lower income communities and Black and Brown communities, right? So being part of this and really trying to make sure that that transition incorporates the voices of underserved communities, I think that's something that really excites me and it makes me really happy to be part of this conversation. And then, more broadly, the future of transportation could look really great, right? If we take this more holistic view about how do we move people and goods, and given all these investments that we're having right now and these conversations that we're having about the future of transportation, I think it's a great opportunity for us to rethink the transportation system and improve mobility for folks and just make urban living a much nicer thing, right? That's less congested, less polluted, and make it really work for everyone. So that's what really inspires me to continue to work on these topics.
And all of these ideas are fascinating. And we also want to open up the space in case you want to share anything with the audience as a takeaway from this conversation or anything else you would like to add for our listeners.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, I'd love for the audience to sort of take away a feeling of optimism about, the future of transportation. I think we're headed in a good direction, but we really do need to be cautious about what that glide path to full transportation decarbonization looks like. And particularly to make sure we're doing it in a low cost and equitable manner. I would also really encourage folks to check out my organization, Resources for the Future. We do a lot of really great independent research that's policy focused. We're trying to inform policy through robust research. And so, part of what we do is besides policy engagement and research, we do a lot of communication. So really trying to get the word out, could translate our research into something that's more understandable to a broad audience. So if you go onto our website, you can see a lot of resources and a lot of blogs or reports or different type or explainers, even things that can help a broader audience who aren't technical experts really understand some of these issues. And I would also say if there's students in the audience, please check out our internship opportunities. We have a lot of them. And feel free to reach out to myself or to other fellows at RFF, because we're really interested in extending capacity and working with the next generation of potential researchers.
Definitely. We'll include those links and resources in the show notes so that our audience listeners can access them. Thank you so much, Dr. Spiller, for taking the time to share your insights and knowledge with us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
I now chat with Chris Merola, a film student at USC and a recent owner of an EV, about what excites him about driving an EV. And I have some fun asking him to become an EV salesperson for a minute. Here's our conversation. So could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your interest in EVs?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Chris. I'm a student in USC's master's program in film and television production. I really like anything that kind of pushes the boundaries of society. So I think that my interests in the arts and electric vehicles, though they may not seem super related, they are very related because they're kind of all about like pushing our understanding of what's normal and what's expected and progressing us towards a future that's safer, cleaner, more inclusive. And so my initial interest in EVs was a little selfish. I was just interested in some stock investing stuff. And in 2019, I discovered Tesla and traded with them from 2019 until Q2 of this year. As a result of that journey, I became a lot more informed about the EV landscape, the vehicles themselves, the legislative difficulties, public perceptions, the sales. And I even bought an EV myself in 2021, and I really enjoyed it. I'll never go back. It's so great. It's a Tesla Model 3. And so yeah, I guess I just have an interest in the ways that we can progress society and make it different than what it is. The idea that things are the way they are and they have to stay the same forever, it's like, no way. We're always moving forward. We're always changing.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear you've become an early adopter and a fan of EVs. How has driving it been? What excites you most about it? What do you like most
It's
about it?
so fun. The car is really smooth. It's got really, really good pickup. So if you ever need to speed up for any reason, it's a really smooth, like powerful ride. Speakers are really nice. I really enjoy supercharging. It's a really fun experience for me because superchargers are often right next to malls, grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops. So you're always getting an extra little adventure in your day if you choose to stop and supercharge. The only reason why I supercharge regularly is because I don't own a home. I live in an apartment. You know, if I were a homeowner, I'd have just a plug in the wall that I'd be able to charge my EV at the end of the day. But yeah.
Have there been issues since you live in an apartment with charging, or have you found that to be manageable?
It's fine, you know. I mean, it would be nice to have a charger at home, but I've lived my life and it's been a-okay because I have to charge about once a week because I'm a regular commuter. I live about like 3 or 4 miles from USC. So my weekly driving does not exhaust my range. My car's range is about 250 miles, which is, you'll find that the median right now for EV range is about 232 miles. So that's about the average. And I don't fully exhaust my battery during the week. And I usually will just, when I go to get groceries, I'll just charge it up, and it takes about 30-40 minutes to get a full charge, which is about as long as it takes me to get my groceries.
Gotcha. So it is much longer than like charging at a gas station, but you plan around it. You integrate it into your daily routine, so that makes it more
Yeah,
manageable.
absolutely. I think that's the one thing that we can expand our minds on with EVs is people think like, oh man, like I really don't want to have to spend all this time charging or doing this or doing that. But it's like, you know, when you go to a gas station, all you're doing is pumping gas. So that's like 10 minutes that's like genuinely just dedicated to that. But when you're doing an EV charging situation, you plug it in within 30 seconds, and now you're off doing something that's valuable that you would have done anyway. So you're actually doing like two valuable things at once. So I don't really see it as a waste of time necessarily. I just see it as a expanding my definition of, uh, what charging your vehicle looks like.
Two of the biggest hurdles I hear about people buying an EV are sticker shock and range anxiety. So maybe could you just explain these challenges and how you deal with them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll define them first. Sticker shock is basically the fear that EVs are more expensive than a regular ICE vehicle. Range anxiety is the worry that EV charging stations are infrequent. And when your EV runs out of battery, it could just crash in the middle of nowhere and you won't be near electricity. So that is a cause of a lot of anxiety for people. Now, I think they're both unfounded. And I actually, one thing about Tesla, you know, Elon notwithstanding, I think their PR and their advertising is a bit lackluster. They believe that the people who buy their products should be the salespeople for it, which I guess maybe I'm an example of that right now. But for the most part, I think that they're doing the world a disservice because if their mission is to accelerate our transition to sustainable energy, they would do well to have more informational advertisement so that people could get over a lot of these misconceptions. So I'll break down sticker shock first. So I just looked up before we hopped on. The average price of vehicle right now is $32,000. So that's the typical entry level, like a medium sized car price. So you know, if you were to buy, say, a Tesla Model 3, the sticker price is about 39,000, but there's this $7,500 EV tax credit that the Biden administration has brought into effect. I believe, and you should double check this, but I think you can get it upon purchase of the vehicle. You may not even have to have it apply to your tax credit at the end of the year. So if you subtract 39,000 from 7,500 from 39,000, you end up with 31,500. So just on the sticker price alone, an EV is cheaper. However, when you consider other aspects, the prospect of owning an EV looks even more tantalizing. For example, a 2020 study found that EV users are 60% less likely to, sorry, they spend 60% less money on fueling their cars. So if you were to have spent $1,000 a year on fuel, you'd actually probably spend about $400 a year on electric for your EV. So that's more savings in your pocket. Additionally, EVs require less maintenance. You know, Teslas, for example, have over-the-air updates. So you'll often see stories that say like, oh, X amount of Tesla cars were recalled today, like 500,000 Tesla cars were recalled. What that actually means is that an over-the-air update was issued to all Tesla vehicles. Technically, that's a recall, but it's so efficient. It's so easy. So you never have to bring in your car for recalls. Additionally, you don't have to bring them in for oil changes. You'll never have to worry about an engine issue because that's just not a thing. So I would say sticker price it's a matter of perception. When we look at the facts, it's actually very, very affordable to own an EV. Anybody who's buying the average car should be buying an EV, one, because they're just better vehicles, two, because they're better for the earth, and three, because they're actually cheaper to own. So I would lay sticker shock to rest. Range anxiety is a slightly more complex issue. I'll admit some caveats there. Like I said earlier, the median range for an electric vehicle is about 232 miles. It's not like you're going to charge to 100% every time though. We all have cell phones, and I'm sure when you charge your cell phone, it's not recommended to charge it to 100% because that actually degrades the battery. The same will go for your electric vehicle. You'll actually want to charge it to about 80% of its capacity on any given day. So what that means is if your car is like 250 miles, you probably only actually want to charge it to about 200 or so miles for your daily usage. Additionally, you'll want to do like more regular electricity, not like supercharging. I'm like bad. I just supercharge my car. So I've degraded my range by about 20 miles over the course of 3 years of just supercharging. It's kind of stopped at that point. So when I bought my car, it was like 260. Now it's at like 240. So that's the maximum that it'll charge to. As far as your daily usage goes, I don't think many people are driving 200 miles in their commute on average a day. They're not driving 100 miles to work and 100 miles back. And most people are going to have a charger outside of their house or their apartment building. So whatever your daily usage is for your EV, you'll just come home, you'll plug it in. It'll be totally charged by the time you leave for work the next day. Now, if you're like me and you have to supercharge, it's still pretty convenient because you can combine it with a grocery trip. Additionally, say you want to go on a road trip. I've gone on a few myself. I'm from New York originally. I had to drive my car out from here, I think it's like 6,000 miles, if I'm not mistaken. I had to drive it all the way over here from New York. And I did a PA gig in Oklahoma last summer, so I had to drive all the way to Oklahoma and all the way back. And I have to say, it's a really pleasurable experience to go on a road trip with an EV. It's super fun. I'm not going to lie and say it takes as long as if you were driving a nice vehicle, because it does take a little longer because you will have to be stopping every 150 so miles to be topping off your EV. But I will say psychologically, the enjoyment is so much more because you have built-in bathroom breaks, you have built-in meal breaks, you get to stop by all these different like really cool rest places. And additionally, if you're going in the same direction as like fellow EV owners, you'll actually make friends along the way because you'll often be unwittingly stopping at the same rest stops. So I've driven 500 to 600 miles with the same group of people in a day. And it's really fun to like see them at the rest stop and then talk to them. And so you make new friends. It's really fun. It's an excuse to get out, stretch your legs, see more of the world. So I really enjoy it. But, it probably does add, another couple extra hours to your trip if you drive with an EV, but you certainly are never in any danger of running out of electricity. There are superchargers and EV charging stations all over the US. There's literally well over 10,000. And many other EV companies have adopted the Tesla charging standard. So whether or not you drive a Tesla, you will be able to stop by a Tesla supercharger and use that when you're on a road trip. So those are
definitely.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, those are definitely some perks that we wouldn't have thought of initially. Do you think the road trip would have been significantly more difficult or maybe more stressful though if you were not driving a Tesla, just because I feel like a lot of EVs still, you can't use a Tesla charger if you were doing a road trip?
Question. If I wasn't driving one of the cars that uses Tesla's charging standard, and to be clear, there aren't that many. Many of them have changed the standard, and I'm blanking on which ones precisely do not use the standard. But if I was driving one of those cars, it would take a little longer because you'd have to stop by a traditional charging station wherein a supercharger will charge your car to full within 30 or 40 minutes, maybe 50 at most if you're really topping it off. A regular charging station will actually only do about 35 miles per hour. So you would actually be substantially slowed down in that case. And that is a really good point that I hadn't considered. So yeah, if you're driving one of those cars, maybe a road trip you'll have to be very patient.
Okay, so bottom line, say you're an EV salesperson. I'm a nervous first-time buyer, maybe EV skeptic. What are you going to tell me?
I would say just jump in. Like, it's so great. Maybe if you're nervous, drive with a friend who has an EV. At this point, we all know someone with one. You'll see that they're really smooth drive. You'll see that the range isn't a big deal. And if you talk to your friend about it, you'll realize that they probably got it for a cheaper price than what you're looking for if you were looking to buy an ICE vehicle.
Awesome. So to conclude, what inspires or motivates you about the future of electrifying transportation? Or is there anything else you would like to share with our audience?
I think it's so exciting. If you look at the auto industry, it's very resistant to change. EVs were attempted actually earlier in the history of the automotive industry, but it just didn't work. I think what's so nice is it's so rare that new changes are introduced. And anytime someone's daring enough to say, hey, let's transition the world to sustainable energy, they're actually more likely to put a lot of really exciting secondary features into their cars. Like I'm sure you've heard that a lot of these cars, they have like games built in. You can watch Netflix in your EV. They have really good audio systems. They have these awesome over-the-air updates. And so what's really cool is that when we innovate the world towards a cleaner place, we also often invite really exciting new innovation, and we shake up industries that were getting old, we're getting complacent, weren't introducing exciting features to our product holders. So whether you are excited about the future of sustainable energy or not, and I hope you are, regardless, the technology and the products that we're getting out of this shift are just really inspiring and really thrilling.
Great. Yeah, well, I'm definitely more interested and intrigued and going to look more into EVs. I know this is a pretty hot topic. EVs are, have a really bright future. And thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Of course, yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
Finally, I chat with Beth Prakash, a new EV owner in the Bay Area, to hear about her and her family's experience driving across the country in a recently purchased EV. Here is our conversation. So thank you so much for joining us today. And so maybe to get us started, could you tell us a bit about yourself and maybe what you understand by energy transition? I understand you have a background in biology and marine biology. So thinking of how this influences your perspectives on the energy transition and climate change.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to be on your podcast today. So my name is Beth. I live with my family in San Jose, California. So we're in Silicon Valley, a bit north of where you are. I work in ed tech currently and have a general passion for science communication. So I have experience teaching science in a formal setting in classrooms, as well as in informal settings, such as museums or in laboratories as well. So to me, the energy transition is about changing where we get our energy from. And usually I think of going away from fossil fuels to more renewable sources. And my background in biology and marine science has absolutely influenced how I look at this issue. I do come from it looking from the biology side of things. My experience as an undergraduate, I think, really started to shape how I look at this issue. I was very fortunate that when I was an undergraduate student, Al Gore actually came to our campus and gave his Inconvenient Truth presentation. So I actually got to see that presentation live, and that was an amazing experience, and got to meet him at a reception afterwards. So to be exposed to that as an undergraduate and start to think about some of these issues was really impactful on me. And through my fieldwork in my marine science degree, I got to go out onto the coral reefs, which are some of the most sensitive ecosystems that are really starting to see the impact of climate change. And I got to see the effect of bleaching, see bleached corals, and actually seen it got worse since even when I was an undergraduate. So getting to firsthand observe these very sensitive ecosystems definitely had an impact and kind of created this passion for climate change and how it's really impacting our planet.
Absolutely. And you just gave me goosebumps when you were describing kind of the reefs and the bleaching. And I understand that you've lived in Texas, Missouri, Florida, and now in California. So maybe could you maybe tell us a bit about how the community has responded to the energy transition and climate changes in these different spaces, how it seems to be different or maybe similar in the states or in the areas where you kind of navigated within these past few years?
Sure. Yeah, I have moved around a lot, but some of these states I lived in several years ago, so I'm sure they're different now from when I actually lived there. But one thing I can say that I saw in common between all four of those places is that people there rely heavily on their vehicles to get around. So that's why I think EV is an interesting topic, because it is a personal choice that a lot of us can make no matter where you live in the US that can potentially impact climate change and this idea of energy transition, because most of us drive. Most of us are not involved in creating laws or public policy, but this is something that we can make an individual decision on, which is really can be impactful, I think. So that was something I saw that was similar. I do live in California now. We've been here for almost 2 years, and we moved here straight from Florida. In Missouri, I did buy my first hybrid car. That was many years ago. The car salesman tried to talk me out of it. He didn't think it was a very good investment. But to his credit, that was several years ago. So hopefully he's changed his mind since then. But in Texas, there's just a big oil culture. I think if you stereotypically picture Texas, you might picture a cowboy and a longhorn cattle and maybe an oil rig on a field, and there's just so many oil and gas companies that are headquartered there. There's a bigger culture on oil and gas. Moving to California has been really different, especially with respect to EVs, because I see it in two ways. The public buy-in, there are so many more electric cars on the road here. I mean, I think I was stopped at a large intersection and I counted at least 5 or 6 Teslas, waiting at the red light around me. But also in infrastructure, there are charging stations everywhere. I mean, the 7-Eleven 2 blocks from me has it. Go to my local Walgreens 3 minutes down the road has 10 Tesla superchargers in front of it. There's just charging stations everywhere. So I think it's easier to adopt this new technology by buying an EV car if you can easily charge it anywhere. So you don't just have to charge it at home. My husband works for one of the larger tech companies in the area. They have chargers at his office. So charging our electric vehicle has been really pretty easy. We had a friend come and visit us from Florida. They own a Tesla in Florida, and they rented a Tesla to come visit us in California. So they opened up their app to try to figure out where to charge their car, and were amazed at all of the EV charging stations that were available near us.
Absolutely. And I understand that you recently took a family trip with your new EV to Yosemite. And maybe could you share a bit with us how you planned around this trip and how it was different with maybe a hybrid and like planning with an EV, and maybe what different aspects you took into consideration while having this long trip along the I-95 from Florida to the Northeast, and how you manage with all of that?
Yeah, so it's something that I think is really exciting about EV technology now, because I think when they first came out, their ranges were so low and chargers were so sparse that people tended to have an EV and they had 2 cars. They would think, okay, I'll use my electric vehicle around town for my short trips, and I'll use my gas-powered car for my long-distance road trips, right? And I now think that technology has come along to a point where we can flip that. We can take an electric car on a little road trip. And what I found about San Jose is I think the people that work here, because we have a lot of tech workers, right, in my area, they work really hard Monday to Friday. So on the weekends, they want to get out. And California is so beautiful. There's a lot of places you can take little weekend road trips from within a few hours. And so I was initially a little concerned of, okay, I have tons of chargers near my house in San Jose. Am I going to find chargers out in the mountains 4 hours away in Yosemite? And we did. So we did our research. We pulled up the app, and our car actually, this is a great incentive, right? They came with free charging through Electrify America stations for 2 years for 30 minutes of charging. And so we look up our Electrify America charging stations, and you can just plan, okay, this is how far we have to drive. They'll tell you, you need to charge here. Here are your options for having a charging station. And so taking a weekend road trip from this area was really pretty easy. So we found a place right outside of Yosemite. We stopped, we had food, and it was a fast charger, right? So you think, oh, you're adding so much time to your road trip. But really, we plugged the car in, we walked up to the Taco Bell, had a bathroom break, ordered some tacos. By the time we sat down, the phone pinged that the car was charged. So it really was pretty fast. And then when we drove down into Yosemite Valley, there were chargers there too. So there are a couple of lodges that actually had electric vehicle chargers in the parking lots in front of the hotel. So I didn't know that there would be a charger in the national park. I thought we'd just have to rely on charging just outside the park, but there were chargers inside the national park as well. So that made it a lot easier. So you do have to do, I think, a bit more planning in advance and think about, okay, what's my mileage? When am I going to need to charge? But then it's kind of nice to have a little break in your road trip too. And probably supports those local businesses and the little restaurants and things in that area. I personally have not driven, an electric vehicle north on I-95, but I do have a friend who did, right? They have a Tesla in Florida, and I think they just drove north to see how easy it would be, and found that the chargers were pretty easy to find on I-95. But once you get off the freeway, depending on where you are, it can be kind of hit or miss. So you really have to look at the infrastructure of where you're going. But I think a lot of the EVs come with really cool apps, which will just show you a map, and it can even plan your route for you of, okay, you could drive this number of miles and then you have to get off and charge. So it seems to be like highways are still okay, but maybe the further off you get, it might be harder to find somewhere to charge.
Absolutely. So that's great to consider. And for our audience that maybe are considering in investing in an EV, or are kind of thinking about this idea, or even renting one for a road trip, this is something that they can think about if this is one of the aspects that they're considering. And finally, as maybe a question to wrap this up, and we always like to think about the future. I understand that you're a mother of 2 young children. And maybe what are your hopes for the future world of them growing up regarding to energy, regarding to climate, and maybe any further advice for our audience that may not be a science expert, but mostly coming from a mom expert perspective?
Yeah, I can see how far we've come since I started driving. I remember being a teenager, and then when I was in college, got really excited about hybrid technology, and would have been able to purchase a hybrid vehicle. And shortly after we moved to California, I learned about the new law that says that by 2035, all new cars sold in California must be zero emission. So that sounds like a really lofty goal, but 2035 is not that far away. That's the year after my youngest son turned 16. So when my kids start driving, and they're in elementary school right now, it's going to be all new cars are going to be zero emissions. So the cars available to them are going to be really different. Are they going to be going to driver's ed driving a Tesla? I don't know. They might learn to drive on an electric car, and the idea of a gas car just maybe seem really old fashioned to them. We also live in Silicon Valley, so we get to see all these tech companies trying out their self-driving cars too. So that might be a big influence on how they get around when they're older. And we see the cars driving by with all the cameras and sensors. So it's really interesting to see. And one of the other things I thought about was just more transportation in general. I grew up traveling a lot. I was very fortunate. And my kids, we travel a lot as well in my family, and we take long trips as well. So we fly a lot. That's another part of transportation. And I was thinking about traveling to Mars, right? I looked up, when does NASA think we're going to get there? They said in the 2030s, possibly. So the idea of travel, I think, is going to change, right? Our world is getting smaller because we fly long distances much easier. And hey, planetary travel might become more normal when they're adults. That might be something that they're thinking about. We already have, right, commercial space flight where you can just kind of just reach the edge of space now. So I'm really excited to see what transportation is going to look like when my kids are teenagers and young adults. I think it's going to look really different, especially here in California. And I guess any mom advice I might give, a couple of values that I try to teach my kids that I think relate to these topics is, first, when they were really little, was just to try to teach them this love of our planet. Just get outside, go to the park, go to the beach, go for hikes, go for a bike ride, teach them about different ecosystems, take a day trip into the forest. We've been up to the redwoods here, for example, just to love and appreciate this planet, so that no matter what they do in their career, they'll always have this value of wanting to protect our planet and try to conserve what we have. And also then to show them how we're all connected. So it's not just we live here in the suburbs and there's nature out there. It's something that we are all connected to. We have to take care of these ecosystems, the plants and animals that live there, but also each other in our communities and our fellow humans. And we teach them, of course, about trying not to be wasteful. But the biggest thing, I think, in relation to energy transition is trying to model for them embracing change. So when this new technology comes along, like electric vehicles or self-driving cars, possibly, embrace this technology and learn about it and want to try it. Don't try to resist these changes. Just because that's not the way it was done in the past, we can learn about some really cool new things and to try to embrace that.
Those are great insights, Beth, and I very much appreciate you giving us these possibilities of thinking about the future and how future generations might understand the world differently than we do. So we're all here for the ride. And I don't know, hopefully we'll get to see some of these changes in our future years. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, we hope you enjoyed these conversations, exploring the challenges and opportunities of electrifying our transportation system. Our work is certainly cut out for us. The challenge is going to be about more than just how many new EVs will be sold. It will also be about rethinking mobility and how we get around, from whether car ownership is still the way to go in many cities to other transportation avenues, including long-haul trucks and air travel.
I agree. The mobility angle will be the key. Initially, I was thinking about what it would take to get me to buy an EV for my next car, rather than a gas-powered vehicle. The student responses helped allay those fears for me, at least here in California. But Dr. Spiller opened my eyes to look at a much bigger picture as well.
In developed countries, we have the advantage of funding incentives and policies in place to help build transportation infrastructure. But in developing countries, the market for 2- and 3-wheel vehicles may be the path forward in changing how we fuel transportation solutions. Other factors like how fun the car is to drive, the power, and even in-vehicle entertainment may help spur the sale of EVs. Future trends in autonomous vehicles will likely also shape the market.
As always, the energy transition is up to the changes that each of us are willing to make as individuals and as a society. Until next time, we hope you learned a little bit more about the story of the energy transition, because the energy transition is up to you and me.
We would like to thank the USC Arshaki Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a lower carbon future, for sponsoring the podcast. Special thanks also to our guests today, and for Abhi, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to Energy Transition Talk. Please leave a rating and review and let us know what you found most interesting from today's episode. And make sure to subscribe so you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina, signing off from Energy Transition Talk. Stay tuned for our next episode.